Good morning, everybody. Have a great panel here to talk about resilience, specifically in the digital age. And I kind of, the leading after smart city discussion into resiliency, I think it's kind of interesting because one of the things that we've been talking about is sort of framing what smart cities truly are supposed to be. And at the end of that, we reference it as like on the rise, and rise standing for resiliency, innovation, sustainability, and equity. And resiliency has this huge piece of it because if you're building things, they have to survive through different situations. So you want to be able to recover very quickly. And in the digital age, you then build and scale and build redundancy and various other things to ensure that these core components in the digital age still survive. So you have to have power, you have to have a connection, you have to have compute, all these various different things. And we have a panel of people here that are going to represent various different areas. And let me go ahead and start off to my left. So introduce yourself and your role and how awesome you are.
Good morning, Fred Bonewell. I'm the Chief Security and Safety Officer for CPS Energy. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. So I've been in this role, Hugh, for about 3 years and 7 months, according to LinkedIn. So all that time has been safety, security, other administrative areas, and then the last year I've been also heading up our gas solutions area in the company. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you. I've been a veteran to this industry for nearly 40 years. I started my career at Louisville Gas and Electric, Florida Power and Light. I worked across the pond with a company called Enel, where we were in 33 countries around the world. Back to a large contractor with Duke, and then here. And this is totally an awesome experience. This place that we live in is so special, and the company that Paula has built and continuing to build for the future is totally awesome. It's just a privilege to be here, and I'm humbled with the opportunity.
Yeah, glad you're here, Fred. And Amanda?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. My name is Amanda Keammerer. I'm the Vice President of Cybersecurity at the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce. I'm also the Director of Cybersecurity San Antonio. So our program serves to convene, connect, and brand the cyber ecosystem here in the San Antonio region. So I get to work with folks like Fred all the time on initiatives that impact our community. Prior to this, I worked in Washington, D.C. for 8 years, started off in nonprofits with LULAC and the Kaiser Family Foundation, and then worked in the White House in the previous administration under President Obama for the Federal Chief Information Security Officer and the Federal Chief Information Officer. So bringing that experience back home. I'm born and raised here in San Antonio. Fun fact, my high school prom was in this building, which is weird to be speaking on a panel in this room. Last time I was in this room was for that, which is a long time ago. So yeah, it's fun to be
Good
here.
memories.
Yeah, good memories. So yeah, happy to be here.
Good, and Rahul?
Good morning, everyone. Rahul Gupta. So I've spent 32 years in this business, first 15 years in the U.S. government, legislative branch, executive branch, and independent commissions, presidential and congressional commissions. And the last 15 years, I've been in consulting. This is my third partnership. I've been focused at the intersection of technology, innovation, specifically focused on telecom and anything that has to do with digitizing the infrastructure. Why that is because at the end of the day, the way we're going to address our issues really have to do with knowledge and focusing that particular information set on what we do for our life and how we build our infrastructure is critical. I'm truly looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. And John?
Hey, good morning. My name is John Stafford. I'm with a cloud software provider called Smart Energy Water. I spent most of my adult life helping utilities roll out their smart grid infrastructure, and a few years ago saw the light that we had really built that infrastructure for ourselves as utilities to sort of reduce operating expenses, and that it was really about the customer, a lot of what you heard in the earlier groups this morning. And so this company focuses on helping utilities provide smart engagement for the consumer and digital engagement for the workforce, and we'll get into in a minute how that intersects with resiliency.
Awesome. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So I was CIO in San Antonio for 13 years, and I was at San Antonio Water System for a couple years before that. So, like, I have links to all of y'all in different parts of my career. Rahul, I want to start with you. We talked with you and your team kind of about a resiliency framework. You want to go into that?
Absolutely. One of the things that today's world is facing because of urbanization, we got a little bit of a summary on what's going on with urbanization and population from Chris. How do you address hazards? How do we prepare for an understanding of what is going to disrupt our life? So if you go back to the number of tornadoes and hurricanes, and if you go outside the United States, typhoons that the world is starting to face, from a resiliency perspective, it's absolutely critical to understand what are the hazards. And I don't think we spend enough time understanding as a we, as a us. It's really about not just me, it's about the community. What are you going to do about water? What are you going to do about power? What are you going to do about transportation? So focusing on understanding that hazard is absolutely critical. And then having the ability to respond is essential. Then you get into the recovery mode. I think that in the United States, we spend probably a little over $800 billion a year on addressing the impact of hazards. But the way we harden our water, our housing, our power is absolutely critical. If I were to tell you today, you can drop your phones and start operating without your computer or your phones for the next 24 hours, I'd like to see how many of you are going to be functional or productive. In the past, people would look for the things like water and power. Today, if you run out of a battery on your phone, it's like panic mode. But we are not really focused on understanding the hazards, understanding our response, our recovery, and then the rebuild part. So I think the World Bank has funded those projects. The United Nations has the RISE program. FEMA and DHS focuses on it. But the cities, on the infrastructure side, digitizing is absolutely critical. How do you put the sensor into your infrastructure so you can go from reactive to dynamic, from static to proactive, and then how do you go to predictive? That is only going to happen if you go from analog to digital, digital to smart. So resiliency is not one of those things that everybody pays attention to, but the more and more we deal with flooding, with sea rise, with the issues associating our food supply, coronavirus has to do with resiliency. How quickly can you produce masks? How quickly can you produce medication? No one has really thought about the supply chain. No one has really talked about the brittleness of the supply chain. So I think resilience is a critical element and foundational to how you can go towards a smart infrastructure, smart city.
Agree, definitely. Because as we continue to expand these things out for cities of the future or smart cities or cities on the rise, you're adding more and more things into this environment that you have to be conscious of resiliency, even though it's sort of this buzzword, but you have to be conscious of it. Let's talk about partnerships.
So partnerships are the key to the future. We are privileged to provide service to this community that we serve, and so we are very cognizant of the cost associated with these services. So what we have found that be very, very advantageous to us and our customers as well is the power of partnerships, which Paulette talks about all the time. And it's harvesting within the partners of the DoD that we serve here in San Antonio, Joint Base San Antonio is the largest joint base operation in the United States. And in addition to that, they are our largest customer. So last year, we entered into a privatization agreement with them to serve electric and gas for the next 50 years. We don't take that privilege lightly, nor do we take it for granted. And we realize that to serve means it's going to be unacceptable for us to think about being in a situation where someone takes over our infrastructure in any way, shape, or form, and they have control of it, and then we lose our ability to provide services to the part of this country, the military, that makes our nation great and provides us with the sovereignty that we have. So we have entered into this partnership with them that's been built over the last 18 months. And to Paula's point, we entered into the conversation with this point about getting to yes, knowing that there are lots of barriers in the way to get to the end goal, but you've got to build the sails on top of those barriers to sail that boat to the end. And we're doing that. So we have, through this partnership that Paula has led, through the officers at Joint Base San Antonio, we have entered into an arrangement with them where it's truly collaborative, and with the city as well, and civic partners. But we're building a circuit that will be totally hardened, from electromagnetic pulse, solar flare, and it probably will be the 3 to 5 year play to build this out. But we are on this mission, and we are going to accomplish this mission. It is not going to be easy. It's going to require a lot of folks' support, both locally, regionally, and federally, to pull this off. But we're not in just the thinking stages, we're actually in it, working on it. And the power of partnerships is so critical, because when we think about the rates that we have for our customers, it's very difficult for us to think of something, do something, because we've got to always figure out how that plays with our customers in the end bill. So by doing this on JBSA property, it gives us the net benefit of finding dollars through their efforts and through the partnership that are going to be advantageous to us and the community at large, ultimately.
Yeah, and I think it's exciting here in San Antonio, having spent a lot of my life here, how far advanced San Antonio has taken itself, because I've been CIO at various different places, and what's happening in San Antonio now is quite amazing, with how the understanding is the city has all these responsibilities, the city of the future concept, but yet it can't do all this stuff alone. It needs the partnerships, it needs these collaborations. And I remember when the city began to fund the cyber position with the chamber. And you talk about your partnership perspective and the things that you're doing.
Yep, I think everything that I do is based on partnerships. And I think, being from San Antonio, there really is no other place that works so closely together. We were talking before the panel about how everybody knows everybody in San Antonio. I'm sure if you're at a table, you probably know somebody who knows somebody in this space, especially. And to kind of foot stomp what Fred said, there is no other city in the country that's doing what Fred at CPS Energy and Joint Base San Antonio is doing. And Joint Base is the largest in the world, in the entire DoD. So to know that that's taking place here in San Antonio with that footprint, with that risk profile, is really impressive. And I think for Cybersecurity San Antonio, we're about 5 years, going on 6 years old. We started as a partnership between the city, the county, and industry. And essentially, folks looked at San Antonio and said, you're sitting on a gold mine of resources when it comes to cybersecurity, when it comes to national security. What are you going to do to mine it? You don't have anybody focused on this. And so my predecessor launched it in collaboration with the industry. And today, it's pretty impressive. We have about 450, almost 500 people on our listserv, our meeting invites alone. And that spans K-12, higher ed, startups, city, county, state, federal, increasingly global partners, our military partners, federal partners, our utilities. And so we try to be this one-stop shop for all things cyber in San Antonio, and increasingly beyond cyber, just national security in general. and with the assumption that if something goes wrong, something goes down, something happens that impacts our city, nobody's going to come to save us. And so if you're visiting from out of town, I would challenge you to go back to your cities and ask your cities, if something happens, do you understand, right, to what Rahul's saying? You know, nobody's going to come save you. And I think it's scary a little bit to think of it that way, but when you have partnerships, when you have industry, when you have research, when you have universities, when you have everybody knowing everybody and somebody dedicated to connecting and convening that community together, it makes it less scary, because then you're bearing that burden together, you're sharing information, you're figuring out not just the technical side to these solutions or to these challenges, but also the people side. The resilience of your people, the resilience of your partnerships. That way, no matter if Fred, leaves us tomorrow, all these partnerships can still continue. And so I think it's really exciting to be in that role and to bring people together and to figure out how do you make yourself resilient against any type of threat.
Agree. So John, let's talk a little bit about cloud and sort of the embedded resiliency concepts in cloud and some of the things that you guys are looking at.
Yeah, sure. I think that another sort of angle on resiliency is data resiliency. I think most of us in the room, when we hear that word resiliency or security, we think of it as a defense, right? How am I going to protect against hardware failure? How am I going to protect against HVAC and fire failure? How am I going to protect against a disaster? But I would encourage us to also think about resiliency as an offensive weapon. We certainly do at Smart Energy Water. And what I mean by that is if you took the cliff notes from Paula this morning, it was customer, scalability, and sharing, right? And one of the things that cloud allows us to do, and the resiliency of the cloud, is sort of to get up out of the silos and have a capability that's in the cloud that in many ways is built in a layer of data resiliency. Not just a few months ago, there were 13 utilities that were hacked, right, on customer PII. You probably saw that news, right? Well, now you don't need to keep customer PII in the customer database within the utility anymore. It can live at the payment processor, and some of the cloud digital engagement capabilities give you ability to sort of eliminate that risk and provide data resiliency by protecting against customer PII. So we see, and we would encourage you to think about the fact that once you're in the cloud, you have a ton of resiliency that might be difficult to replicate over and over and over again here within San Antonio, right? You heard Shri and you heard Vivian talking about what they're building out in terms of customer experience, but they could even have one customer experience solution if they wanted to, where the customer got the electric and gas and they got the water information all on the same app. I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying it's possible, right, to be able to do that where historically with own and operate and trying to provide all this resiliency within your own systems, it might be difficult to do.
Yeah, and for anybody, PII is personal identifiable information. So it's the things that someone can use if they know about you to do harm to your credit, et cetera. So for John, I want to talk about the fact that, as we look at these advancements in cities, we start pushing things farther out to the edge, right? You have smart water meters, smart electric meters. You have, like here, we have connected transportation, traffic control systems. With that becomes a different conscious of how you design these things, how you lay them out. So talk to me about your approach to ensuring that, first of all, they're resilient, and then I'm going to shift it over to my left side to talk about how you then secure and protect them as we start expanding this stuff out.
Absolutely. I think you have a page from on your table that kind of talks about ongoing innovations for smart infrastructure in cities. I've been fortunate enough to manage and run a little over 30 smart city projects around the globe, from Asia to the Middle East to Europe and in the US. And all of them really focus on the comment that John made, data hardening, right? If you do not have open data policy, it's really hard to go from data to information, information to intelligence, intelligence to knowledge. After all, we are all now used to pulling out a device, which is a supercomputer, and pushing some buttons, and we don't understand the magic that happens behind it. And the magic that happens behind it is actually connecting disparate infrastructure domains and creating that synthetic picture. That synthetic picture that tells you you are here, and what you want to do is over here, and that gets connected. So when we start talking about the smart cities play, and we start talking about hardening and data, it's absolutely essential that a city has an open data policy, that that data is secure, that the containers that it sits in, both are physically and virtually secure, and that when you're generating that new knowledge, what truly moves a city in a way that reduces the cost of providing the service, increases the stickiness to the consumer. I want to live here because the city is doing things for me that I can't get somewhere else. There's an entire underlayment of infrastructure, the fiber, the coming 5G, all of the telecommunications layer that really needs to be hardened. And I think without a partnership model, without those solutions, it makes it very, very difficult to deliver that. But all of that can disappear just in a moment's notice. If I shut down the power, I disrupt a database system, or I cut the connection to the cloud, or I do anything, that brittleness, I think, is absolutely essential to understand. So when we talk about all of the ongoing innovations, all of the services around this wheel with the partnership in the model, each one of them needs to be hardened in a way that is resilient. And I agree with you that we talk about resilience as a defensive posture, but it shouldn't be. Resilience really needs to be aggressively managed, and it cannot be an add-on like cybersecurity cannot be add-on. It needs to be built as part of your strategy. It needs to be built as part of your funding model and your organizational design. If I were to just ask you to talk to each other at the break and say, how many people do you have in your organization that are actually ready to have this conversation, and the future of the workforce that can help you get to that, that is another part of resiliency. Organizational resiliency, I think, is missing in many organizations that don't know how to deal with the transition from analog to digital, digital to smart.
Agree. John?
Yeah, I'll just add that in our case, a bunch of the resiliency came to us for free because other people built it out, called Amazon, Microsoft, and IBM with their cloud products, right? So two of those partners we use in the deployment of our solutions, and a bunch of the resiliency is really a function of what those clouds already provide by their design. So for those of you in the room who are building your own things, you probably already know that, right? But it's very cool how much resiliency already comes. Then it's about the integration of using that multi-threaded capability and using the pipes to get to reach into the legacy and current own and operate systems within the customer, right, and bolt them together in a secure way. But a bunch of the failover, a bunch of the multi-threaded capability, all of the scalability, where you no longer really have to size how much hardware do I need to put this thing on in order to make it go, right? It's scalable, and as you have additional usage on the systems, they'll scale themselves and take care of it. So, I mean, that's a very cool, kind of sort of free catalyst that we all get to take advantage of in the industry.
Right. And Rahul, you mentioned something that's kind of important. I think as you look at these projects, these different pillars need to be identified as you go through the project, right? You should be assessing the resiliency piece. You should be assessing the security piece. You should be assessing what is the story at the end of the project that your citizens can adhere to once it's done. And I think that's a very important point. Shift over to my left. Let's talk about now we're starting to build all this cool stuff off. You know, we're doing these fun things, supposed to have these great outcomes. We got to secure this. Let's talk about it, Fred.
So you talked about design we talked about design, we talked about building it in. So at CPS Energy, we've adopted this model of the 6 pillars. So everything that we do, regardless of tactical or strategic, it goes through these 6 lenses that include security. So this is top of mind, and we know in our industry that security now is the #1 risk that utilities are facing around the world. So we've got to make sure that everything is seamless and integrated automatically. We have to have a governance structure with security that's built in with all the leadership, and we have everybody at the table. So we can't leave anybody off the table. We've got to have supply chain there. We've got to talk about how do we protect the bill of sale? How do we encrypt the parts that are sent out to the original equipment manufacturer for refurbishment? It's not just do we send somebody out there like we do to observe this work, but let's ensure that if that company is sold to a nation state, that our parts are protected. So it used to be that we thought in this industry about securing the perimeter and that was enough. But it's like the infiltration that took place in the city of Troy. They fabricated this, what looked like to be a very attractive, oh, this is cool, we want to interact, but they were the enemy. And all of a sudden they got in, and then we know what history said after that. So we've got to start thinking about protecting inside. And it also starts with our people. And we have great advantage with the new generation of hires of employees that are coming in now, and they know all of this about gamification. But we also know that the cyber experts, the best in the world, are also gamification experts. So we should take advantage of this opportunity. It's not just sitting there and sweating it out, worried about who are we going to bring in and who are we going to help. We've got help right inside our own house that we should be harvesting to help us for the future. So it's also about another facet of this is taking care of our people. At CPS Energy, we've adopted what we call care champions. This sounds like something silly, but it's not. These cyber experts are now being taxed 24/7, 365 in all hours of the night to respond to a threat email or something that is a threat. It keeps our cyber people up. And so we've got to make sure that we take care of them. We're finding out through the military, this is a big deal, even inside the military, about taking care of the cyber experts to make sure they're available to support and to help us. But it's all inclusive. That's my point. It's all inclusive. We can't let anything aside from us. Give you a data point. So we know that there was challenges in the geopolitical environment with Iran that occurred over the past 60 to 90 days. And since then, we've averaged about the blockage of about 50 million IP accounts a week. A week. This is huge. And it's not just to CPS Energy, it's to all of our civic partners, our DoD partners, and all the utilities around the world.
Agree. You know, one of the things that you brought up that I want to touch into is the workforce resiliency. And I know, Amanda, you brought that up as we were in our discussions. And I think it's interesting how we've changed so much in progression with technology, but in a lot of ways we haven't changed the mindset on how we manage our workforce. So most of us hop on the road at the same time in the morning. We go to a building, we do this work, and then we hop on the road on the way home. And it impacts our transportation resiliency. It impacts, you know, the various different things of how we manage our workers. And you know, one of my philosophies is that at some point, if we can change the way we manage people with deliverables, and we know they're deliverables and the time frame they're due, then we can manage people from wherever they are, whenever they are, as long as they've delivered inside that window. And I know you have a passion about talking about the workforce resiliency.
Yeah, so Fred kind of led into that as well. So with workforce, I think it's super important, as you all have probably heard 50 million times, or if not, you're going to hear it today, that by 2022, it's projected that we'll have a global workforce shortage in cyber of 1.8 million jobs. So you can't produce 1.8 million people. You're not going to have 1.8 million births, and those people are going to be born babies that can protect us in cybersecurity. So we're just not going to fill that shortage, right? And going back to being realistic, going back to thinking, if worst case scenario happens, how are we preparing for that? When it comes to workforce, we're kind of already there, right? We have this huge shortage. We have a national security imperative to fill these jobs. And so if we can't hire them, if we can't recruit them, if we can't retain them, then we have to go and identify them within our workforce and reskill, upskill, figure out what they're good at, what they like to do. A lot of times, when's the last time you asked your workforce, what do you like to do? What do you not like to do? What do you want to learn about? Is there something about cybersecurity, information technology that interests you? And more likely than not, they're going to say, yeah, I've heard a lot about cyber and I can probably make more money. How do I get there? And being able to build an environment where you can be honest as a manager or honest as an entry-level staffer or even a receptionist. Think about it. How would you react if your secretary, administrative assistant, if your marketing person, if your data analyst came to you and said, hey, I want to be a cyber analyst? What's the pathway? Would you know how to answer? Would you be ready as a manager to have that conversation? In the same way, if somebody clicks on a link and it starts freaking out and your screen goes black and other screens go black around you, does that person feel comfortable going to you and saying, hey, I messed up, I clicked something, I need to report it. Do you have an anonymous mechanism in your office to do that? I think all those things are related to workforce resilience. Even in the K-12 level here, we're starting to figure out or strategize for our K-12 computer science teachers. We can't even fill those jobs, let alone cyber analysts and incident response folks. We're thinking high level, just our computer science teachers that need to teach and prepare our students, knowing that we have a digital divide, knowing that women and minorities are not represented proportionately in this workforce. We have all these other barriers to deal with. We can't even hire computer science teachers to be there, let alone cybersecurity teachers. So just thinking through all these different places where we can have an impact and create partnerships, create excitement around this field, and get away from this image of a guy in a hoodie in a basement with green code on a screen, and that's cybersecurity, right? That's not cybersecurity. That really isn't, and that's not really what a hacker does, right? So how can we change that conversation in our organizations? How can we look out for each other? And in looking out for each other, you're lessening your risk of having an insider threat pop up within your organization, right? And if you think there's not a threat within your organization now, you're probably mistaken, right? There's somebody who might be thinking or might be upset. So knowing your workforce, interacting, having those conversations, being open, all of that is people stuff. That's nothing technical. That's nothing advanced. That's not a platform. That's not something necessarily that needs more funding. It's just taking time to think human to human. How can we take care of each other, and how can we incentivize taking care of each other as well? And then that will lead into, I think, more resiliency overall.
Agree. So I'm guessing we're up against the lunch. So let's open up for questions from the audience.
I guess since nobody asked a question, I might just pop in one here. And we all talked about resilience in the context of getting ahead of the problem. I think I heard pretty much, I think it was Rahul that said we have to become more of an offensive, take a more offensive approach to resiliency. I'm thinking also that in the good old days of how do you deal with a piece of equipment going down, you get a second one, have a redundant system. Do you see redundancy still playing a role now? Especially when we're dealing with things that are not physical, but they're more sort of amorphous or even almost non-existent in a physical sense. And what role do you see redundancy playing as an approach to dealing with resiliency?
Yeah, personally, I definitely see it as a component, but it's way more advanced than it has been before with software-defined networks and all these various different things. It has to be there for these things to take place, and others, y'all can step in.
If I could just say quickly, I think sometimes you got to pull it back to supply chain security overall, and just knowing who your vendors are, what you have, Where's it at? And if you don't know, just turn it off. Like there was somebody recently who said, they're trying to figure out what router went to what and what connected to what. They just turned it off and waited for someone to yell at them and figure out, whoever needed it, they would let them know. And so I think, redundancy is great, but if you don't know what you have and where it's at, what it's connected to, what's important, a lot of people don't even know what's super important. So you might be looking for something to be redundant when it's really not critical. So you're spending more money that could be, redirected to other places. So I would just say, big picture, just start to know what you have and then figure out where to direct your resources.
Yeah, I would say redundancy is not resiliency. Redundancy has a role to play. You have to define what do you want to make redundant and why. Is there some mission critical application or mission critical operational role that you want to have a backup in case the one that you're operating on goes down? But resiliency is being able to absorb the blow, keep operating. Maybe you operate at a lesser scale, but you're providing those services that are absolutely needed. And I think diversity in terms of the way you are doing your compute, the way you're doing your consumption, the way you're actually providing your ability to manage your infrastructure is critical. So it's not inconsistent, but I think it would be an error to confuse redundancy with resiliency. Those two are very different activities. They go hand in hand. I think they need to be addressed equally, and it's equally important that people understand the difference.
I think it's also tied into that. It's how we plan for the new architecture of the future. So it's a matter of a wholesale looking at everything that's connected. Not just do we have the grid for the electric grid, but we have millions of miles of gas infrastructure underground that we also have to protect as well. So it's bringing in the right experts to support us in thinking through this on the front end, so we just don't plow into an RFP blindly. You've got to have all this stuff figured out before you get into that stage.
Agree. Anybody else? Time's up. That's great. Any closing comments from y'all? I think it was a great discussion from all of y'all.
Yeah, just a shout out to
Appreciate
Z Prime and CPS for doing this. I mean, I hope these kind of conversations continue and they happen around the country. It's an important topic.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is echo Z Prime and CPS, and also very impressed with what CPS is doing, especially what you're doing with EMP, because at the end of the day, the last test that the Russians, the Soviets at the time, and the Americans did was 1962 on the EMP. And if an EMP of 12 kiloton hits the United States, it doesn't have to be somebody that it's on our target list, but it would basically bring down the grid and your ability to do your Facebook and Instagram for up to 4 to 10 years. That should scare everybody.
As they say in Russia, it would go kaput.
I would just say to keep asking questions. I think the more curious you are, the more inquisitive you are, the more you feel comfortable asking questions, the more resilient that you'll be.
Yep. And resiliency isn't a destination, it's a journey.